Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I am going to be talking about the new album from Tim Hecker, Love Streams. Tim Hecker is an ambient composer from Canada, now having become fairly well known as well as very well loved by his fans for his unique style of glitchy, distorted, mediocre to bad audio quality style. Now, I just got done talking about M83 not too long ago, a band who also had a highly distorted sound in their early discography that really bothered me and prevented them from truly being great in my eyes. But with them, I didn't like it because I felt like they were trying to go over the top, and by distorting their sound, they ended up feeling like they were held back by the limitations of digital audio, completely undermining the feel that they were intending to go for. Tim Hecker is no better in the distortion department, especially in his earlier stuff. In fact, he does it way more than M83 does, but at the same time, it doesn't bother me even close to as much. Mainly because Tim Hecker's music is a lot more emotionally ambiguous. The clipping audio still reminds me of being limited and closed in, but unlike M83, Tim Hecker is not trying to be huge and awe-inspiring. As he is creating more ambient music, he's using the clipping audio to support the mood he's creating, which is generally much more uncomfortable and spooky. In that way, he puts it to far better use. Now, I'll have to admit, while I've heard of Tim Hecker for a while now, I've only just gotten into his music in the last couple of days. So I've only been familiar with his work for a couple of days. I mean, I still liked what I heard a lot, though it may need time to grow on me. I don't consider him like one of my favorites of all time, but he has a unique style that no one else dare copy, and he has done a good job of keeping his formula fresh over the course of 8 albums now. So here's my thoughts on his discography so far. Every track on here is a multi-parter, and while I'm not sure if some of them deserve to be separated, they do lead to me paying attention more than usual for ambient music. That being said, it's not his best. Sometimes I forgot I wasn't listening to Brian Eno, but it's pretty solid. Lots of distorted and staticky ambient soundscapes that Hecker has now become famous for. This is where he started to really find his usual style. I think it's good, but I think he built on this formula with subsequent releases. This one has a similar sound to that of Radio Amore, maybe a bit darker, but I honestly think this one pulled it off even better. And then he topped it again. This album's just beautiful. Well, the instruments are much more recognizable than usual, but otherwise, this one doesn't really bring anything new to the table. Kinda disappointing overall. Also nothing really new, just kind of a mix of Harmony and Ultraviolet with Haunt Me, Do It Again. But it's much more memorable and better executed than the previous album. Lots of harpsichordish noises that remind me of certain moments on Aphex Twin's Drux, as well as overall, lots of actually recognizable instruments presented in a much better and more creative way than Imaginary Country. Pretty awesome. One of his best. Which brings us to this album. So despite the fact that Hecker has a pretty obvious formula, he's managed to keep things just fresh enough to still hold my interest over the course of 7 albums. So how does this new one fare? Well, first of all, I think this album has quite a bit in common with his last album, Virgins, in that he was using a lot of different instruments that were actually recognizable, but still presented in his usual abstract way. The first difference that comes to mind is the instrumentation. Obviously, we don't have any more Drux-style harpsichord sounds anymore. We now have, well, a lot of different instruments. The most notable addition is human voices. More specifically, an entire choir on several tracks. This choir apparently gets filtered through auto-tune in some places for the heck of it, but I'm not sure where those moments are, to be honest. But for the most part, this more or less sounds like similar experimentations to those on Virgins. But may as well just go down track by track now. We start with Obsidian Counterpoint, which is a big pad of these fluttery little synths, lots of flutes, and these big bassy washes coming in here and there. with some pianos and organs coming in later on, all the rhythms just floating off into the distance. One thing that really stuck out to me right away on this track was how pleasant and refreshing it sounded. Tim Hecker doesn't usually do things of the soothing variety, so that made for a nice change of pace. Music of the Air is next, and this started out with some happier than usual synths, and bringing in the above-mentioned choirs, chopped up into pieces and getting covered in distortion near the end, because of course it is. At the end of this track, though, everything just once again floats away, leaving just a synth pad and a guitar solo, segueing directly into the chaotic BJ Dream. This track is mainly carried by a random and sharp synth melody, which I'm not gonna lie, sounds extremely reminiscent of the melodies on the more intense parts of Oneotrix Point Never's R+7. Anyway, Live Leak Instrumental, I noticed after a few listens, combines a few elements from the past 3 tracks. The bassy washes from Obsidian Counterpoint, the ambient pads from near the end of Music of the Air, and the sharpish Oneotrixy synth tone from BJ Dream. It's kind of a weird move, but nice touch. I've not seen people do that before. But then everything floats together into the distance again to make way for Violet Monumental, our staple 2-parter track, and the point at which the pleasantness starts to disappear. Part 1 starts out with a dramatic organ-like synth chord, bringing in some subtle bass notes here and there, and more chopped-up choir noises. The choirs start to get really crazy here, like, it almost sounds like someone is musically yelling at some points. At the end, everything gets covered in distortion, because Tim Hecker, and everything fades away, leaving the organ and a piano melody. This leads directly into part 2, which keeps the same organs as before, but adding a new Baroque-ish synth melody on top, which also sounds kinda like an organ. I hear some kind of clarinet sound about halfway in, and it's really bassy and smashes through the mix like the bass washes on Obsidian Counterpoint. Violet Monumental as a whole is a really epic and intense track, and one of the standouts for sure, but it disappointingly ends with an almost abrupt fade out. I guess it's kinda like an old vinyl album that ended its first side. I'd have liked some transition here, because, you know, he's good at those usually. Anyway, the second half begins with Up Red Bull Creek, which goes back to the more soothing sounds from earlier, starting out with some ambient washes and getting some more intense guitar-like synth leads near the end. Probably not one of the more memorable tracks for me, but then we get into Castrati Stack, which right off the bat starts with the choir sounds being covered in intense distortion noises, just like the old days. There's other synth melodies here and there, but the overall feeling is slowly getting darker, like his older stuff. The choir gets wider and wider, and the distortion is all over the place, before everything gets chopped up by this kind of clanking percussion, which sounds like someone shaking a dog cage or something. And then all the sounds blending together in one huge epic ambient pad. Then another more laid-back synth melody on top, signifying the beginning of voice crack. Then the ambient pad gets replaced by a guitar solo. Then halfway in we get more choirs again, although unlike the previous track, they are actually more welcoming and pleasant. At least until the very end of the track, where everything gets really dissonant and crazy and creepy. But then the whole atmosphere suddenly cuts away to a more distant sound as the fittingly titled Collapse Sonata starts, which has some brighter synth melodies on it. And halfway through, all the melodies just abruptly stop. Like, just cut off completely. Like, this part always makes me think I skipped a track or something, but I didn't actually. But it makes way for more ambience, which eventually grows into this huge, almost cataclysmic sounding blend of synths, ending with organs again. Finally, we are led into the closer Black Phase, which may be the darkest sounding track on the album. This track is mostly led by this really intense, distorted bass, with some occasional choirs repeating the same dark but epic melody over and over. At the end, as most tracks on here do, everything just blends together, leaving the bass and another organ. And that's it. Though things started out pleasant in the beginning of the album, the second half is clearly much darker and more epic and like apocalyptic sounding. So overall, this was a very fun album to listen to, especially when I started to go in depth and notice all of the little changes and details. Sure, all the tracks seem to end more or less the same way, but more than anything, this album leads me to want to go further in depth on the other Tim Hecker albums. As of recording this, Love Stream is the only Tim Hecker album that I've really gone in depth on and soaked up every last detail, and it was much more impressive than I would have thought on first listen. I don't think this album is his best. As mentioned earlier, all these tracks seem to be structured in more or less the same way, and the transitions are kind of hit and miss. But if this is the kind of thing that I can expect from this guy's other stuff, then I'm excited on what I'll find on his other releases. So I guess I'll have to get around to reviewing his other stuff sometime in the future. This here probably is not his best, but it was definitely an interesting and fun experience, and it definitely gets my recommendation. Overall, feeling a solid 8 out of 10. Favorite tracks: Obsidian, Counterpoint, Music of the Air, Violet, Monumental 1 and 2, Castrati, Stack, Collapse, Sonata, and Black Phase. Least favorite track, Up Red Bull Creek. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it. But I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But, yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.